I want to take you to Vietnam in 1990. Vietnam had just gone through decades of warfare with France, with the United States, with Cambodia, and then finally with China. The country was war-torn and devastated, and 2/3 of the children in the country, millions of children, were malnourished. Well, in 1990, a man named Jerry Sternin from an organization called Save the Children came in as a nutritionist to try to combat that problem. Now, Jerry wasn't the first nutritionist to go to Vietnam. Others had gone there before, and they had pointed out some observations that Jerry would say true but useless. They'd come and say, yeah, there are millions of kids here that are malnourished, and the problem is poverty. The problem is lack of trade. The problem is lack of infrastructure. The problem is lack of education. The problem is the government doesn't have enough money to buy all these things. Well, yeah, those were all big parts of the problem, but just pointing out those problems didn't help the country at all. What Jerry did is he went deep into sort of the hinterland of the country, and he started working with some villages that were really, really hardly hit. And what he did is tested the kids in this one village where they were doing the pilot project. And he found that about 90% of the kids in this village were malnourished. It was terrible. Literally hundreds of children in this little town had distended stomachs. Like it was pretty ugly. But then Jerry noticed 90% of the kids are malnourished, not 100% of the kids. What's going on with the 10% of the children who aren't malnourished? And when he took a close look at those children, he found that their parents were doing things differently than all the other parents in the village. All the normal parents were good-hearted parents who gave their kids the best, whitest rice, the purest rice, and they were doing their best to feed their kids. But the 10%, they were doing some things that the other villagers didn't know about and wouldn't have approved of. So one of the things they were doing is they were taking some of the sweet potatoes and the sweet potato greens and chopping them up and throwing them in with the rice. Well, nobody else did that because sweet potatoes, that's pig's food. What parent in their right mind would ever feed their children with pig slop? That's disgusting. So 90% of the parents didn't do that. 10% of the parents did. Something else that those parents did is that in and around rice paddies, there were these little tiny shrimp and little tiny crabs that sort of grew in there. Well, most normal parents looked at those the same way you and I would look at earthworms and slugs. Don't tell me you're putting that in the rice. Oh, that's horrible. But 10% of the parents were in fact putting those little shrimp and crabs in with the rice. So 10% of those kids were getting quite a bit more calcium, quite a bit more protein, quite a bit more vitamins than the rest of the kids, and they weren't malnourished. So what Jerry had to do was convince the other 90% that you should change your perspective on how you're looking at food. And what the results were in that pilot village is when he first went in there, they counted 434 kids that were malnourished. 1 year later, went from 434 down to only 68 kids were malnourished. And the year after that, only 33 kids were malnourished. Well, 5 years later, the entire country adopted his methods, and 2.2 million children were moved from malnourished to healthy. The malnutrition rate in that country went from 66% of kids down to only 9% of kids. Literally changed a nation. Well, what does this have to do with church? Well, today, across the continent, 80% of evangelical churches are either plateaued or in decline. Now, we've heard things like this, and sometimes we pass it, oh yeah, well that just refers to, the mainline churches, but we're doing okay. Actually, we're not. Our churches are in trouble. Big churches, little churches, country churches, city churches. 80% of churches, no matter what the denomination, plateaued or in decline. Now, a lot of people will make true but useless observations about this. Well, our society is more secular. Our society has more video games and tech. Our media is more anti-Christian than it's been. Our school system is more anti-Christian than it's been. Our music is more anti-Christian. Hollywood's more anti-Christian. How can we possibly compete? Okay, that might be true, but that isn't going to help us solve the problem. Same batch of true but useless observations. Well, let's look at the 20% of churches that are growing. Now, when we do look at those 20%, we find most of those churches are growing by transfer. They're just feeding off of other churches. But 20% of the 20% are growing due to conversion. They're actually reaching their communities with the gospel and seeing people getting saved. Now, 20% of the 20%, that's 4% of the total. That means 96% of churches are not successfully following the Great Commission. But what happens when we study that 4%? What are those 4% of churches that are actually reaching people doing? And what we find is that they're thinking differently than the rest of the churches. And they're acting different than the rest of the churches. And the good news is we've been doing this long enough that when a declining church or a plateaued church adopts the same mindset, adopts the same practices of the thriving churches, those declining churches can turn around and start thriving themselves and grow by reaching lost people. So what does a healthy church look like in the first place? Well, a quick snapshot of what these thriving churches look like is they look like a collection of local missionaries where the whole congregation is there to be salt and light in their communities. That missions isn't something that just happens in faraway lands, that everybody's involved in this. Those thriving churches are churches that are driven by the Great Commission. The Great Commission isn't something they just give lip service to. The Great Commission isn't something that they view as an add-on. No, the Great Commission is the main thing, and they bring everything they do into alignment with that Great Commission. Now, there's a lot of ideas out there in church world about how do we measure the success of a church. Some churches measure success by size. Some churches measure success on how cool they are. Some churches measure success by growth. Some churches measure success by knowledge. We know more than they do. Some churches measure success by charismatic experience, that we speak in tongues more than those guys do. There's a whole bunch of different measures for success. But when you look at that 4% that are growing because they're reaching lost people, you will find there that the only measure of success that really matters is that they're creating self-reproducing disciples. They are completely focused on that Great Commission. And what they're trying to do is create disciples who make disciples who make disciples. And oddly enough, when you pursue that path of disciples who make disciples or disciples, a lot of the other things come into place. You will grow numerically. You will grow in knowledge. You will grow in your spiritual walk. Quite frankly, a church that is focused on making disciples who make disciples, that makes all the difference. So food for thought. Why do you think that churches that produce self-reproducing disciples grow in attendance? Why would that focus result in the other phenomena? Why would you think that churches that focus on self-reproducing disciples also grow in their walk? They grow in their knowledge and they grow in their spirituality. Paradoxically, why could churches that focus either on attendance growth or focus either on their walk can end up failing to make self-reproducing disciples? Figuring out these answers will take us a long way in understanding the problem and understanding those solutions.